Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Today we're getting to the part of the Beatles' career when they decided touring wasn't for them. Well, this shook Brian up, but he couldn't stop them from demanding time away. Peter Brown is giving his insights during this time in the Beatles' lives. So let's see what's going on today. It was the fall of 1966 when the Beatles went their separate ways. It was the first time in 10 years that they had time to themselves. The funny thing was that at this time, without telling each other, they started to wear their hair longer and sport mustaches. Surprisingly, Paul adjusted the best. He was busy. He was dating Jane Asher, and he bought his first house on Cavendish Avenue. It had 3 baths, 2 guest bedrooms, and separate quarters for the couple who came to take care of Paul and Jane's needs. Paul and Jane furnished the place themselves. The floors were covered in deep pile carpets in sedate tones of brown and gray, and Paul had a closet built that ran the width of the 22-foot room. His bathroom was tiled in imported blue and white mosaics, and he built a sunken tub big enough for 2. Jane encouraged Paul to get away from it all, so he bought High Park, an isolated but beautiful farm in the moors of Scotland. And Paul started a self-improvement program. He read, he went to foreign films, and he became sophisticated. George Harrison started to blossom at this time. John and Paul had thought of him as a third-rate Beatle, but in public popularity he was in third class too, and a tie with Ringo. George got into Indian music, and he met Ravi Shankar at a London party one night. Shankar invited him to India to study with him. In October, Patty and George went to Kashmir for 2 months for a study vacation. Ringo, he didn't need much out of life, and he tinkered with his expensive toys and his cars, and he enjoyed the London nightlife. Maureen, she waited up for him no matter how late he came home, and she had a hot meal for him if he was hungry. And by wintertime, she was pregnant with their second child. John had the roughest time with the separation. He found relief from the pressure, but he felt lost. It was at this time he thought about leaving the Beatles altogether and going on alone, but he depended on Paul, and he wondered where he would end up. Las Vegas? He wasn't happy with his life with Cynthia. She cooked him dinner every night and brought it to him in the sunroom, and they watched TV as they ate, changing the channels every few minutes and not speaking. That doesn't sound too bad to me. But everyone was giving him offers, but he didn't do anything. It was then that he decided to take a role in the film How I Won the War. He took Cynthia with him, along with Neil Aspinall, and a suitcase full of drugs. John was bored with the filming. He spent his time in a canvas chair in a dressing trailer or waiting in the hot sun for the next shot to begin. His role was small and not interesting. The part he enjoyed was playing a death scene after being shot. When he and Cynthia watched a screening of the movie, she broke down and cried. She told John it was exactly the way he would look when he died. When they got back, it was the holiday season, and there was all kinds of parties to go to. This is when he began to experiment into psychedelics. John went overboard and took acid every day. He thought he could find the key, the answer. He was 26, stoned and unhappy. It was at this time that he met Yoko Ono at her art exhibit. After that, they met up numerous times. They didn't have a passionate physical affair. They had intellectual feelings. Brian was going downhill. He kept looking for love in all the wrong places. He would go from London to New York to Spain every few weeks. And that winter, he turned to LSD for the first time. Brian enjoyed the experience. The only trouble was he did it too much and without precaution. LSD plus his uppers and downers and booze would have him up 3 days at a time without sleep. He was psychologically and physically on edge of collapse. He was in need of professional help. But Brian didn't believe in psychiatry. One day, Brian was to be interviewed with Murray the K. He was going to convince the fans that the Beatles weren't breaking up. And Peter went to wake Brian up. He was sound asleep, and he was too groggy to get up. And Nat came later to take him to the studio, and then he discovered that Brian needed to get revived. Peter was so upset he started to scream at Brian, and it even shocked Nat. Pete said, "Don't you know how sick you are? You can't go on like this. You have to stop. Go to a hospital or a doctor, but get help." And Brian weakly told him to calm down, and Peter said, "I can't stand by and watch you do this to yourself." Brian said he was going to the shower and get dressed for the interview. Peter said, "You can't go to the interview. You make a fool of yourself." Brian insisted, and Pete said he wasn't going to go, and Nat had to go get him there. Murray the K saw how Brian was, but pretended it wasn't happening. Peter said he wasn't going to listen to the interview, but he couldn't help himself. He said Brian's voice sounded slurred and deep, but he was eloquent. Brian said, "I think they might play together again, but in another concept entirely. At the moment, they're doing great stuff in the studio. They take longer to make records on their own volition." As the interview went on, Brian's words became clearer and his conviction stronger about the future of the Beatles. Murray the K asked what the next big thing would be, and Brian said, "A good tune. A good tune is always the next big thing." That autumn, Brian decided with the pressure of running NIMS with many acts and functions, it was getting too much, and he wanted to get rid of it all, except for the Beatles and Cilla Black. They were all he ever cared about. Finding a buyer for NIMS wouldn't be a problem. There were offers all the time. It just took the right person. Brian made an offer to Robert Stigwood and a man named Shaw, and he would sell them 51% of NIMS, a controlling interest in reverse takeover, to avoid sustaining a large capital gain. Brian would still be chairman of the board and would look after the Beatles and Cilla exclusively. Stigwood and Shaw could have the rest. The price would be £500,000, which sounded like a small amount compared to the $2 million he was offered 2 years before. Paul at this time had everything he wanted except a wife and kids. He was madly in love with Jane. She could control him and deflate his ego without destroying his pride, and she gave him back his humility. Jane loved Paul. He was sweet and well-meaning. He would be a wonderful father, but he couldn't be her whole life. She didn't want to be in the shadow of a Beatle. John and Ringo didn't have this problem. They were married to northern women, and they understood. George married a London girl, but she put her career aside when George felt threatened by it. Paul had to be separated from Jane for 3 months while she went to America to do stage plays. During this time, he worked on the Sgt. Pepper album to keep himself occupied. He flew to America to help her celebrate her 21st birthday. On the way back, he thought of the idea for the album Magical Mystery Tour. Paul wanted to talk to Brian about this, but Brian was under a doctor's care at a private clinic. They were trying to do a sleep cure for him. He would be kept in a state of induced sleep and fed intravenously, and when he was awakened, he would feel revitalized and refreshed. Well, that was the plan. Brian was supposed to be asleep on that first night. When the nurse came in, he was sitting up in bed writing letters. His dose of sedatives would have been enough to knock out 3 men. The clinic finally figured out the dosage they needed, and he slept for a week. When he was revived, he said there was only marginal results. When Brian met with Stigwood, he told Brian he signed the group the Bee Gees to NIMS. Brian hated them from the beginning, probably because they weren't his discovery. Brian didn't have much hope for them, but they had a #1 hit immediately, and Brian was just more annoyed when he heard that. While Brian was at the clinic, he got a large bouquet of flowers with a note that said, "You know I love you, I really do." It was signed John, and Brian broke down weeping. While Brian was there, he got to hear a special acetate of the album Sgt. Pepper's. He was astonished at what he heard. Sgt. Pepper took 4 months to record, and it cost of $100,000. Brian's homecoming was the day of the Sgt. Pepper press party. It was to be held at Brian's Chapel Street townhouse. Peter organized the event and tried to keep it small. He invited the 10 most important representatives of the press to listen to the new album and have a family dinner with 1 or 2 of the Beatles around the dining table. At this time, Paul had met Linda Eastman at a club called the Bag of Nails. Peter introduced Linda to him, and Linda went with Paul to a second club, and they got separated later in the evening. The next day, she called Peter in the office. She said she had a new portfolio of the Rolling Stones pictures. Peter was a fan, so he invited her to his office. Peter liked a picture of Brian Jones, and Linda gave it to Peter as a gift. In return, he gave her an invitation to the Sgt. Pepper photo session. She was dressed up, and when she saw Paul sitting in a chair by the fireplace in the lounge, she got in front of him and sank to her knees and began snapping photos of him. She tried to get to stay, but had to leave with the other photographers. Linda tried to contact Paul by phone, but found out that his unlisted number was billed to Harry Pensker. All the Beatles' unlisted phone numbers were billed to him for security reasons. Later, Linda phoned and asked for Paul. Pensker explained to Linda that she had the wrong number, but Linda didn't believe him. She kept calling back saying that Paul was trying to trick her. Pensker finally had to unplug all his telephones to get some sleep. Now she's giving off shades of Yoko in this description. When Linda got back to America, her close friend Lillian Roxon found a picture of Paul and Linda taken by another photographer at the party. She sent it to Linda, and Linda blew the picture up big enough to cover her bathroom door. She looked at it every day for 2 months, perhaps trying to will him back to her. Klein at this time came to talk to Brian about having Sam Cooke open the bottom half of the Beatles' American tour, but he started to talk to him about something else too. Klein heard about their low royalty rates from EMI and that he could renegotiate their contracts. He told Brian he could get them at least £1 million guaranteed against 10% of their royalties if Brian would let him negotiate the deal and take a fee. Brian, of course, was angry at the suggestion that someone could do his job for him, and he showed Klein the door. Klein then renegotiated the Stones' recording contracts with Decca and got them a $1.25 million advance. It was in the papers. When Paul was asked what moment with Brian he regretted the most, he said it was in a crowded elevator with the other Beatles when he said to Brian, "Yeah, well, Klein got Stones $1.25 million, didn't he? What about us?" Brian got paranoid that Klein was going after the Beatles when in an interview Klein said he would get the Beatles. Brian was scared because he hadn't told the Beatles about Stigwood and his controlling shares in NIMS. He saw the Beatles were getting discontented with him. They were slowly learning about the Celtab fiasco and that Brian wasn't able to get out of bed until 5 in the afternoon because of the barbiturates in his system. Another thing that was going to happen was the Beatles' management contracts with Brian were up in the fall of 1967. He was afraid he would be fired. Late at night when he was drunk and stoned, Brian talked to Nat about it. Nat thought the worst that could happen was that the Beatles might demand a reduction of the 25% commission to only 20 or 15%, since his responsibilities were reduced since they weren't touring. Nat thought Brian was foolish to worry. The Beatles were loyal to him, and he was loyal to them. Out of the four, Brian probably had to fear Paul the most. Paul was outspokenly critical of him. John would cut Brian with a remark, and George was distant, but Paul would call him daily with a complaint. Paul was interested in the day-to-day operation of NIMS, and he would turn up there to look around. Paul found trouble himself in an interview when he experimented with LSD, and he said it in the interview. He even endorsed it, saying it opened my eyes. It made me a better, more honest, more tolerant member of my society. This didn't go over very well, what Paul said, because it could make Beatle fans start taking the drug. Paul didn't want the responsibility in the matter, and when the daily newspapers asked him about the interview, he said, "If you'd only shut up about it, so will I. It's your fault putting it in papers. You got the responsibility not to spread it." And Brian was being called by the reporters too. Brian didn't make matters better by saying he took LSD and he saw nothing wrong with it. He said it made him less bad-tempered. Brian was criticized in newspaper editorials, TV commentaries, and by parent and church groups. Paul wasn't happy with Brian for making matters worse. Phone calls between them went back and forth, and then Brian stopped taking Paul's calls. He felt guilty about not solving the problem. And Cilla Black and her husband were mad at him. Brian took Cilla and her husband to lunch at a fancy restaurant. He ordered champagne, but Cilla wasn't swayed that easily. Cilla asked him what the press was saying about his drug use, and Brian said it was the reporter's fault for publishing Paul's statement. Brian felt that it would have been hypocritical of him not to say that I did it too. And Cilla said she felt betrayed. She said, "What are my mom and dad going to think? That I'm on LSD? It was a very selfish thing for you to say." And Brian apologized eloquently. He was so sorry that she forgave him again. So in this episode, we have the Beatles going in different directions, and the ones feeling the pain the most were John Lennon and Brian Epstein. Brian could not get his act together. He was worried he was on his way out of the Beatles' lives, and it didn't help him to get over his drug addictions. And Brian also made some business blunders once more, and was very afraid the Beatles wouldn't renew their contract with him. Nat had stated that Brian was worried for nothing. Brian was loyal to the Beatles, and they were loyal to him. He discovered them, made them famous, and thought the world of them. And the Beatles appreciated his help, and they all loved each other like a family. It's hard to see how things seem to be going so wrong for Brian, and how the Beatles are riding high in some ways and low in other ways. Well, that seems to be the way of life, but it doesn't make it easy to take. I'll keep exploring the book, The Love You Make, in the next video and see what else reveals itself. Now, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.